shows a quiet workstation at a forging company, in this case basically based on the Clifford Jacobs Forging Company. You see in the foreground simmering degreaser, piece of the block and tackle, and in the background bin or tub full of steel chunks that will be heated in the ovens. You see left rear. It's just a typical forging company spot that is quiet now, but at any moment may come to life as those ovens are fired up and new parts are forged from those steel chunks. In Crucible, you have one of the largest watercolors I've made on the largest available single sheet that I know about, Arch's 300 pound 40 by 60 or 60 by 40 sheet. This depicts the Koppel Steel Mill in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. One of the best sources of industrial imagery I have in one of my early visits. This piece shows the large vessel called a crucible, in which molten steel is moved from one point to the other in the steel making process. You can see that it's a complex factory, and it has a kind of typical hazy air up high in the factory. And the painting is basically made with orange, green, and purple. That is the secondary colors, a color scheme I frequently have used, and I believe this was one of the first times I began to explore that. Vessel is a transparent watercolor and gouache painting, mixed media, watercolor. Gouache is an opaque watercolor and particularly notable for its vivid and brilliant color. So this is one of the first explorations I made with gouache, and was still kind of using it in a transparent way along with transparent watercolor. The imagery here is just an amalgam of kinds of things you see at a refinery or a chemical plant. It's mainly just an invention and an effort to explore the kind of complex, textured, patterny surface that you find in a factory setting, and to explore the paint itself. Industry Genesis is a forging company based mostly on an early visit I made to the Clifford Jacobs Forging Company in Champaign. It's called Genesis because this workstation kind of shows the very first stage of forming a forged part into being. It starts with heating a steel block in these large hot front furnaces, and that red hot steel is transported to the hammer you see in the background where the two operators basically pound that red hot steel into a die, forming a part. On a visit to Canton Drop Forge in Canton, Ohio, I walked into this shop, which was quiet, apparently had not been used in many years. Left in neat order one day, and it was as though no one ever came back. When I walked in there, the dust was so thick that each footstep raised a little puff of dust, and that's why it's called idle. It shows a couple of features that I have seen in many factories of its vintage. In the early 20th century, factory buildings were often built with these glass walls really to provide light for the workers. But unfortunately, sometimes that light was too bright, so it's a typical feature of many of these old factory shops that have those glass walls that the eye-level windows have been painted out or blocked out to keep the blinding light out of the workers' eyes. So I'm showing that feature as well as a kind of a typical furnishings of a forging shop now idle. Man and Fire is meant to depict the furnace aspect of the forging process. When the hammer comes down, pounding red hot steel into die, there is a moment where the fire seems to leap out of the hammer and consume the operator. So this is the idea of a man being in the furnace kind of feeling. There's a frame around this piece, which this image does not show clearly, and which is painted and then coated over, rubbed over with black dry pigment, and then erased back to where you see a kind of a rusted, dark, rough surface as though part of a steel or furnace or boiler plate. One of the first places I was able to explore and had access because of my father worked at the Derby Refining Company, a large oil refining company in Wichita, Kansas. As I roamed amongst these huge units, sometimes squeezing through a rather narrow passage, you would come upon an interesting enclosure, open space, had a sense of being a room. And so in this case, you're in a place that I've called it court. And in fact, that architectural reference to a sort of the kinds of places I'd find, I used that in my titles for quite a while. In this place, you see an interesting door, a mysterious door that goes off to somewhere unknown. An interesting feature for me, as well as just the nature of the cast shadows falling as the sun could find its way down through the machinery and structures. And one more thing that I used in a lot of paintings, this was an early version of showing the bright color within an otherwise kind of drab or gray or colorless place. Color like this, in this case fire equipment, required by OSHA. So sometimes you'd see bright colors in areas that didn't seem to have seen a paintbrush in decades. Crescent is a scene from the Crescent Forge and Shovel Company in Havana, Illinois. You see in this piece my interest in the two kinds of light, one the natural or the sunlight coming through this scaly window, a window having been painted as is typical of lots of factory windows long ago and now peeling. That natural light as compared to the cool fluorescent light over the machines. This factory was very quiet, almost idle, and at the time it was still making a few replacement parts, plowshares for third world countries, a product that most modern American or modern farmers no longer use. The factory was in almost perfect original condition, both the building and the tools, which seemed to have been left in neat order, waiting for the workers to return, and they never did. So it was just filled with wonderful little details, some of which you can enjoy in this picture. Source is a drawing made with black dry pigment rubbed into a sheet and then erased so that what you see as white or light is recaptured light on a blackened sheet. This is another view of the Koppel steel mill in Beaver Falls, PA. And it's trying to depict the sort of thunderous, chaotic, dramatic scene you see in a huge steel mill. One detail of some interest here, if you look kind of in right center, you'll see, if you look carefully, a man standing behind a heat shield. And that gives a sense of the scale of this factory. Kind of an interesting detail. Industry Nave depicts the Canton Drop Forge in Canton, Ohio, the main shop or main work floor area. You see down the left side the large drop hammers that pound red hot steel into forged parts. These hammers have to be kept circulating between the action, and so they are like a big dragon pumping up and down slowly, and each time the stroke comes down, the fire flares and leaps out a little bit, and steam is released above. It's a little like, it's a very dark place, as is typical of these, dirt floor, and so when you walk in here and look at this kind of complexity, it's a little like walking into the 12th century. Forging is a technology that hasn't changed a great deal in that time. The title derives from this being the central large area of this shop, down the sides of which were other narrower aisles. So this had a little bit the architectural quality or the sensation of the central nave of a church. Warbirds 5 is one of several paintings and drawings I made in the late 70s as I began to explore, man-made objects. This is a drawing made with Prismacolor pencils that has recently come back into the marketplace and has been included in this show, though it doesn't exactly fit the original set. A woman in my class, her husband had one of these old World War II warbirds, as they call them, and had been a Navy pilot flying off a carrier in the war. And it was through her and him that I gained access to a hangar filled with these old airplanes, many of which were restored to perfection. And so these became the subject for me for about a year of work in watercolor and in various pencils or drawing media. Coral Pink Sands is a painting of a place by that name, a state park in southwestern Utah called Coral Pink Sands State Park, which describes exactly what you see there. It's vast sand dunes with the usual vegetation you find on those dunes, steep hills with an amazing pink quality, which when the light of the sunset or the late afternoon light is on it, it's amazingly pink. Quite beautiful. Afternoon Lane, Fall River, is one of two pieces painted along the outer lane and at the Fall River, Kansas property. This is a gouache paint. Both of them are gouache paintings, small, and this one is painted over a graphite underlayment. It just depicts the one of many scenes along what we call the outer lane, the upper lane, and it's along that road at various points that I've found all kinds of great places to paint. Evening Lane, Fall River, is obviously the companion piece to Afternoon Lane. It is a gouache painting that tries to utilize the vivid, brilliant colors of gouache. And it's just another variation on the subject matter along the outer lane at the Kansas property. Along the river at the Kansas Fall River property is a high bluff on which there are trees and trees running down a very steep 60 feet or so down to river level. Trees and undergrowth running down that bank. You can get down there, but it's tough. It's sort of a climb. But the view from the one particular spot, as depicted in this Evening Trees Fall River, is one I especially like, with several large old oak trees with lots of character. And in the very late afternoon, the quality of blue that occurs along the far bank, the tree forested area along the far bank, and the reflection off the water surface is striking and a beautiful place. When I launch a new painting of a familiar subject matter, I always try to think of some new way to present that, or some new way to interest myself in the subject matter. Sometimes I see there, after hours of being there, something I've not seen before. Quality of light, texture, some detail. So this is just another piece, not a lot unlike the other work in this show, of Southwest landscape stuff. Some of it's based on what's in front of me, and some of it's just invented as I go. Graceland, too, is a watercolor with pen and ink and frisket. It depicts the kind of Southwest open rangeland with the characteristic red soil and desert vegetation typical of that part of the country. This particular piece is kind of based on a favorite camping spot of ours, the Palo Duro Canyon State Park out in the Texas Panhandle. But it could be anywhere in that kind of New Mexico, West Texas open rangeland. The Flint Hills area of Kansas is one of the last remaining original grasslands that used to span much of the prairie and the plain states, but which has been taken over by farming where farming was possible. The soil in the Flint Hills is so full of rock, and the overburden is so thin that you really can't farm it except in the bottomlands. So the hills remain great, endless hills of grass, wonderful for grazing. And when you're there, you begin to really see those grasses, some of which, like the big blue stem, is over 8 feet tall, and beautiful colors. So I think most people wouldn't think of grass as something to paint, but it's the subject of this painting, contrapose. And you can see within that apparent random tangle in an area of grass, there is much of great beauty there. And that's the subject of contrapose. In Canyon View, you see quite a lot of what I call brush drawing, a very linear kind of textured painting method. In that country of the Southwest, you see so much that seems to require texture to be properly conveyed. The paintings in this show, this one and several others, are loosely based on some favorite camping areas out in what is geologically known as the Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle, in which there are 2 state parks, a lot of private ranch land, and it is next to the Grand Canyon, the largest geologic formation or the deepest canyon in the world. When we're camping, we like to hike, and we generally follow official hiking trails, but occasionally you find paths or routes to follow for some distance that don't seem to be, you feel like you're sort of breaking a new trail. This place in the painting, Palo Duro Trail, was right behind our campsite, and we followed it along a little small water feature, or kind of a runoff creek. I believe this path, which was an easy one to follow, was really carved by high water. It wasn't really an official path. But in this painting, you see some of the features that I never tire of painting: the strata of the soils as you look up the canyon wall, the kind of survivor scraggly trees, and the kind of ground vegetation that I enjoy very much painting. The Palo Duro Canyon, where we like to camp, is about 1,000 feet deep, 2 miles across, and 100 miles long as a geologic feature. Some of that area is dedicated to 2 state parks, and we've camped in both of those in several different locations. It's a great place to paint. It's a great place to hike, and there are some paved areas for bike riding that we like very much. What you see is the amazing stratification up the canyon walls, and some of the typical arroyos and desert vegetation down below. In its early days, this canyon was part of the Charles Goodnight Ranch, one of the early huge ranching operations in Texas. And some of the canyon is still used as rangeland for private cattle herds. Capitol Reef is a national park in southeastern Utah. Beautiful place that's characterized particularly in that country of amazing state parks and geologic features. The Capitol Reef is characterized by extreme high straight cliffs towering over you. That's what you're most aware of. There's a lot of petroglyphs and wonderful details there. Among the things that always interest me when I'm in that country, and particularly at Capitol Reef, is the beautifully colored striations or strata of the earth moving up those canyon walls. And as usual, I'm interested in the creating a kind of a meandering path back into the space, using some of the desert vegetation that is so typical of that country. Dead Horse Point, Utah, is a state park in a small corner of the vast national park Canyonlands, around 30 miles or so from Moab in eastern Utah. Fantastic place, spectacular canyon and winding river. It's the place where the Green River and the Colorado River join, and it's famous for a scene from Thelma and Louise, the closing scene, which everyone thinks is the Grand Canyon, according to the story, but is actually the mesa you see in the center of this painting at Dead Horse Point. It's a favorite place. We love to camp there. It's very difficult to get spots there, but there are 15 campsites right on the rim. So a fantastic place to be for a few days.